Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Once again, my name is Adam Greco, and I'm with Search Discovery. Today's call, we're excited to have Simo Ahava, who's going to be talking to us about web browsers and tracking protections. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping items. During the session, if you have any questions, there is a Q&A area in Zoom. Please try to put your questions there instead of in the chat because it makes it easier for us to find all of the questions. And we will try to get to as many questions as we can at the end in Q&A. For those questions we don't have time to get to, we'll see if we can answer them after the fact and post them in the Slack group. This session will be recorded and the recording will be placed into the Slack group once we're done. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Simo. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this webinar, and thanks to Search Discovery for organizing this initiative. It's pretty amazing to be able to just share some cool stuff to an alert and informed audience. Today's topic is going to be around tracking protections and specifically web browsers. There's a lot of incentive to talk about mobile devices as well, but we're not going to open that can of worms. And we'll just focus on web browsers at the moment. The reason I chose this topic and the reason this topic is being discussed in Search Discovery's education community and digital marketing in general is because much of the work that we do in digital, whether it's marketing, whether it's product or service development, whether it's analytics, it revolves around the web browser. The web browser being the #1 tool with which to access digital assets still today. And over the years, web browsers have seen a lot of misuse from site owners, from users, and as well from publishers and ad tech vendors and third parties who are kind of trying to invite you as the site owner to deploy some kinds of scripts or technologies on your site that serves the interests of the third party rather than your interests as the publisher or the site owner. So as a kind of a reaction to this way how web browsers are being manipulated for some kind of nefarious purposes, web browsers have started taking the initiative in stripping these capabilities away from site owners and from third-party JavaScript running on websites. And in this presentation, I want to talk about this phenomenon more and focus on why you should know about this stuff. I'm not going to say why you should be concerned or why you should be alerted, or there are no negative connotations here by default. Obviously, a knee-jerk reaction to these things is that some things are being taken away from us. Our data is being taken away from us. Our ability to measure things is being taken away from us. But part of this presentation is also about elucidating the other point of view, where instead of something being taken from us, we're actually reinstating a new status quo where third parties can't just use the website as their own digital playground anymore. And this all ties into the current conversations around the globe around consent and informed consent, to be more specific. And that's also a very hot topic here. And it's somewhat similar and somewhat goes in parallel to what web browsers are doing, but there are some differences as well. Obviously, the four main browsers, if you will, I'm not quoting any market shares here, but the four kind of browsers that are dominating the field, especially when it comes to tracking protections, are listed here. There's Edge in the top left corner, Microsoft Edge, and its latest incarnation as a Chromium-based web browser introduced a host of interesting tracking protections. And why it's very interesting as well is because they're actually using Google's Chrome technology to build these. So they're taking the core of the Chrome browser and implementing something that Chrome is sorely missing, which is some kind of tracking protections. Then we have Brave going counterclockwise in the screen. We have Brave on the bottom left. Brave is in many ways the most active in this scene. Their whole business pitch has been around absolute user privacy. Now, you might be cynical and consider them to dilute that somewhat with their own interests as an ad ad provider. But whether you agree with it or not, with their business purposes, what they have been doing in the tracking protection and the blocking cross-site tracking in those fields is pretty remarkable. In the bottom middle, you have Safari, which I think for many people, especially working in ad tech, is the most painful painful one of these, because when they released intelligent tracking prevention in 2017, they really started to dismantle the ad tech paradigm of cross-site tracking with third-party cookies. And they've been doing the boldest moves, considering they have such a huge market share, especially on mobile browsers. So it's very crucial to follow carefully what Safari is doing, because they are very likely to be paving the way for others. And then we have Firefox and Mozilla kind of picking up the game as well with their enhanced tracking protection. In the top right corner, we also have a very interesting browser named Clicks, with a Z, Clicks. They have been doing some pioneering work in tracking protections, but unfortunately, during the COVID pandemic, they released a statement where they're having to turn down their browser development. So the Clicks browser is based, as far as I understood, they're basically discontinued. They still are available, and I really hope that the folks running the browser are still actively taking part in web standards design around privacy protections. But the browser itself seems to be out of the loop at the moment. But I'll still keep it here, because some of the things that they've been working on are really interesting in the context of tracking protections. So these are the browsers we'll be talking about. As you can see, there's one very notable web browser missing from this list. And we will definitely be alluding to this omission, that Google Chrome is not on this list. There's a very good reason for that. Practically everything in this presentation is based on research published on cookiestatus.com. It's a free open source portal for information around browsers and how they implement these tracking protection. Especially this front page, this current status page, should be something you might find very interesting, where the table lists like a feature matrix of how different browsers are currently implementing tracking protections. So it's a good idea to take a look at cookiestatus.com. And if you're interested, as I said, it's open source, so you can contribute as much as you like to its development. We'll get started with a quick quiz, and I'm going to need Adam's help here, because we're going to try this polling feature in Zoom. I have two quick questions that they have two answers both, and one of those answers is correct. So I'll just start with the first question. So take a look at this situation. We have the user is on a web browser browsing a site on site.domain.com/welcome.html. So that's the page open in the user's browser. And on that page, an image is downloaded with an HTTP GET request from cdn.domain.com/image.jpg. So this is the image that is being displayed on the page. Now, when the browser issues this request for the image on cdn.domain.com, which domain's cookies are included on the request? Some cookies are included in the request, but are they cookies written on site.domain.com or cookies written on cdn.domain.com? So this is the first question in the poll. I'm trying to find my mouse again, because I'm currently in the, oh, here we go. Okay, and the second question is, okay, good. I'll get back to the correct answer in just a bit. So we have the majority saying it's the source domain's cookies are included in the request, and then the minority is saying the target. Okay, cool. The next question is the very same situation, site.domain.com requesting an image from cdn.domain.com. Is this an example of a third-party request or a first-party request? Ooh, exciting. This is a pretty cool feature, this poll feature. Get some interaction. Okie dokie, and then let's take a look at what the results say. Third-party request is the minority and first-party request is the majority. Cool, thank you for participating. I will reveal the correct answers in the next slides. So let's look at the terminology behind these two questions. So here we have site.domain.com requesting an image with an HTTP GET request. This is, first of all, a first-party request. It's a same site request. The definition here is that the top privately controlled domain remains the same. And top privately controlled domain means the part of the domain that you can actually own. So if you start looking at the host name, there's no way for a private operator to own .com. So then we look at domain.com. Well, you can buy domain.com, or well, you can't buy it anymore because it's been taken away ages ago. But they share the same domain, so they are essentially subdomains of each other. So they are in a first party or same site context. The terminology can be confusing because they are in fact cross-origin. So the origin does change. The origin is the bolded part of both of these URLs. So they're cross-origin requests, but they are same site and also known as first-party requests. Obviously, first-party, third-party doesn't have an official sanctioned definition. There's no, it changes whether you're talking about data sharing or whether you're talking about cookies or whether you're talking about HTTP requests. But in the context of this presentation, and in the context of talking about cookies, we have a very clear definition here. And then the other question about cookies is that the cookies of the target domain, so where that request is sent, are included in the request. So when site.domain.com requests something from cdn.domain.com, that request will have a header called cookies, and that header will include all the cookies written on cdn.domain.com. And because of something called domain hierarchy, where the cookies are actually shared between subdomains, it will also include cookies written on the root, so domain.com. And this phenomenon of having the cookies on the target domain included in the request is what this whole enterprise of tracking protections seeks to answer. And I'll get to it in just a bit what I mean with this. Let's just switch it around just a slight bit. So here we have site.domain.com requesting an image, but this time it's requesting it from cdn.global.com. So this is in fact a cross-site request because the top privately controlled domain is different. Site.domain.com is requesting something from cdn.global.com. This is a third party or a cross-site request. And again, the cookies written on the target domain are included in the request. So any cookies written on cdn.global.com would be included in this request, unless the browser is blocking third-party cookies, in which case the cookies header manually purged browser actually hits the web server at the end of cdn.global.com. So this is what cross-site tracking requires, this technology. A site requesting assets from a cross-site origin, so something outside their own domain environment, and the cookies stored on that cross-site origin are included in the GET request. So now we jump to cross-site tracking and what this whole thing about tracking protections really is about. This is a very typical scenario. We have all these different pages. We have page on somedomain.com, we have page on otherdomain.com, and then we have yet another domain, so page.thirddomain.com. These are all completely separate from each other. They might not even be owned by the same organization, but they're all requesting the same image stored on image.cdn.com. So as all of these different sites request the same image in a third-party context, image.cdn.com will be able to store a cookie or write a cookie on itself. And this cookie can always be updated, that now we got a request from some domain.com with this ID. We got a request from other domain.com with this ID. And essentially, image.cdn.com will be able to see that the same cookie was present in all these requests from these 3 separate domains. And this way, the ID stored in the cookie can be used to build a graph of how this user is browsing different sites on the web. And this is essentially, for example, how the DoubleClick network works. So we have a third-party endpoint to which requests are being sent, and that endpoint also writes a cookie. And that cookie will then be associated with all the requests to DoubleClick across all the sites you visit. And suddenly Google has this amazingly large data set of all the sites that you've been visiting on the web. And this is what cross-site tracking essentially is. And this is what tracking protections are now trying to block. And we'll get to why they're doing this. Before jumping to cookies, we all know that they're not the only thing that's being exploited in cross-site tracking. So the first thing that when ITP came out, for example, many ad tech vendors jumped to other browser storage as well. So we have local storage, session storage, IndexedDB, even WebSQL. And these can all be leveraged to persist information about the user. Now they're a bit more difficult because they are severely hampered in third-party contexts, but they can still be used to store information and persist information about the user that extends beyond the browsing session. And this is something that, for example, in the European Union, the e-privacy directive has been trying to address since 2002. So trying to address the fact that people's information encoded for a specific human being is being stored past the browser session, and it's obfuscated behind these keys and values, and users might not be aware of this. Then there are other quite imaginative ways. For example, Facebook can add links with identifiers. When you click any link in Facebook, you will get the FB click ID in the URL, which basically contains hashed information about your login. So now if there's a Facebook pixel firing on the target site, they'll know that a user with this click hash visited simoahava.com. So they'll be able to know what happened outside facebook.com, and they'll be able to tie it to a specific user. Similarly, they can actually decorate the refer instead of the outbound link. So before Facebook directs you to simoahava.com, they redirect you through a local page on Facebook, which appends the URL with the ID, and then it will show up as the referrer when you land on simoahava.com. So the previous page URL. And again, the Facebook pixel can then take this information and collect it. I'm just using Facebook as an example here. I don't think they actually do this, but this is a typical way of overcoming some of the protections that are currently up there. Oops, went a bit too far. I skipped over fingerprinting. So fingerprinting is another way to do tracking. It's stateless tracking. So basically a browser settings and the way that your computer has been built, how its graphical processing unit works, are used to collect an identifier about you. And this is like the biggest consensus, I guess, across all browsers, even Chrome, is that fingerprinting has to stop. And so all browsers are actively working towards reducing fingerprinting surfaces. But CNAMEs is an interesting potential exploit as well. So third-party vendors are suggesting with more and more effort these days that sites reserve a subdomain on their own domain environment and have that point to the third-party servers. They typically quote being able to move to first-party cookies as the main reason. So being able to move from third-party to first-party context by having a subdomain on the site's own domain network. However, I suspect the main reason why ad tech vendors are specifically doing this is to avoid ad blockers, because now instead of sending hits to domains that might be blacklisted or restricted by ad blockers, the actual hits are being sent to a local subdomain of the site itself, meaning it might be much more difficult for ad blockers to target. There's a huge risk with CNAMEs whereby, because it's part of the first party context, so it's in a subdomain of the main site, not many people are aware that what the third party is actually collecting, in addition to the hit itself, is every single first party cookie written on that domain and the main domain. So this is very problematic because you're sending things like authentication tokens and login IDs, maybe even personally identifiable information in cookies to these third parties and these vendors who have asked you to set up this CNAME. So I suggest to be very, very careful when being requested to create these CNAMEs and subdomain redirects third-party servers, because mapping those data flows is extremely difficult. So browsers are reacting after, these were some types of exploits used to do cross-site tracking. The reason these browsers are actually reacting to this is that cross-site tracking is just so difficult to prevent. Because the tracking happens under the purview of the third party and not the site itself, it's very difficult to prevent it proactively by users. Ad blockers do help, browser settings do help, but seems like vendors are always one step ahead. Now, obviously, we can argue till the cows go home about whether it's actually a bad thing to have this cross-site data set be collected in the first place. I mean, everybody wants targeted ads if they want ads in the first place, right? I think that's the straw man that's being thrown around by ad tech. But the problem is that it's not really a question of whether it's okay or whether a part of the population is happy with it. The problem is that there is lack of governance and lack of accountability when these data flows are being misused like that. So browsers have decided to take the initiative, and they've decided to start blocking the venues for doing cross-site tracking. And the reason for this is that these things that you see here are typically seen as having negative connotations. So being able to build graphs or target ads or manage ad frequency, calculate view through attribution, do DSP, DMP stuff with cookie matching, cross-site tracking, analytics. These are all seen as having questionable impacts on user privacy. So browsers want to prevent cross-site tracking, and as a result, the things you see here have become hampered a great deal. At the same time, third-party context can actually be used for good as well. So we have things like SSO and login flows, which require cross-site context to work. You need a centralized server to kind of authenticate against and be able to browse different sites of the organization without having to log in every single time. Embedded services like video players would need to be aware of state so that you can watch a video without having to log in every single time a new video is loaded. Multipurpose scripts might definitely have some problematic features in them, but they might also be used for something completely benign. So bundled scripts with fingerprinting capabilities, for example, will be blocked completely, even though you never use them for fingerprinting, you use them for something completely different. And then we have things like first-party data collection, tag management, and so on. So we have these benign uses for third-party context and cross-site tracking as well. But the problem is that browsers do not know, what's good and what's bad. And this seems to change on a whim. All of these can be misused, and all of these can be used for benign purposes as well. So browsers have taken a very strong-handed approach where they basically just prevent access to the cross-site context, period, except in some cases with explicit consent. So then we get to how browsers are actually doing this, and we have this gradient scale here. So how does a browser determine what kind of a third-party context is malicious? So browsers need to be able to say that, SSO is okay, but requesting that pixel from that vendor is not okay. So some browsers implement these heuristics using full lists. Firefox and Brave do this, so they have these lists where just ad tech domains and marketing domains and advertising domains are listed. And if the request is being sent to one of those domains, then it's blocked or then it's restricted. On the other hand of the scale, we have Safari, which algorithmically determines whether or not a domain has tracking capabilities or cross-site tracking capabilities. So we have this difference of how browsers are actually flagging domains for misuse, which very importantly informs the browsers how they should go about blocking requests that are being sent to and fro. I'm just going to go very quickly through this because I want to get to the conclusions. But this is now a condensed version of the same information you'll see if you go to cookiestatus.com. So in third-party context, this is how browsers are reacting. Brave and Safari are currently blocking all third-party cookies. So cookies in third-party context will not be included in the requests. Safari does have an out. It offers the storage access API, which lets websites kind of get explicit consent from the user. Is it okay to allow this third-party domain to share your data? But the UX is pretty interesting. I think it literally says something like this domain will use it for tracking or something like this. So it's a very, they're not really hiding their colors there. They're saying that, you know, cross-site tracking is bad, and if you accept this, then you might be subjecting yourself to tracking. But all the other browsers, Edge and Firefox, are also blocking cookies, but they are blocking cookies on a very specific block list scope. So as long as the domain is in the block list, it's going to be blocked. But they also have mitigations. So they allow even, you know, tracking cookies to be used in case, for example, the user is engaging with the site a certain amount. And these mitigations are really interesting because they really go against the grain of blocking cross-site tracking, because now malicious vendors could kind of abuse those mitigations and get their cross-site tracking to work anyway. And then a lot of work is being done to prevent referrers from passing any information, because they are basically data leaks. And also, if the URLs have these link decorators, then Brave, for example, strips out GCL ID and FB, Facebook Click ID, and Microsoft's Click ID. So Brave is actually, you know, removing information from URLs. And then the other thing that especially kind of flared up when ITP came out with, Safari's ITP came out with version 2.1, is what's going on in first-party context. Because we might be comfortable in thinking that because first-party is same site, then browser tracking preventions that target cross-site would not apply. But the thing is that as soon as ITP was released, vendors who desperately wanted to continue cross-site tracking started repurposing the first-party context for their tracking needs. So they started storing information in first-party cookies, like what Facebook is doing with the Click ID, what Google Ads are doing with their conversion IDs or their Click IDs. And so what Safari started doing is they started actually restricting first-party context as well. And for analysts, people working with web analytics, this is painful because we know that our client-side JavaScript cookies are being severely limited on Safari, and we need to add additional workarounds to make them work. And we're not using them for cross-site tracking. We just want to do first-party analytics. So this is the current. It doesn't look too bad, though. I mean, first-party context is still pretty okay. I mean, there's no blocking going on. There's just restrictions. But who knows what the situation will morph to given time. Then just quickly looking at some things that are coming up. So Chrome will, in a couple of weeks, pick up their same-site enforcement. So this is Chrome's big entry into the game. It's not really a tracking protection per se. It just forces sites to acknowledge what cookies are being used for third-party purposes. And in the future, this information could be used to add some intelligence to tracking protections. But this can be a very big change to sites. So if your site is making use of third-party cookies with SSO or any kind of login flows or any kind of third-party shopping carts, make sure that those cookies have been audited for same site, because you're in a bit of a hurry. It's not going to come full crash on July 14th. That's when they continue the rollout. But the purpose of the rollout is to reach 100 at some point. The referrer policy is being updated in many browsers to kind of strip almost everything out of the referrer. So the referrer string is basically very unusable as an indicator of anything these days. So not just cookies, but all script writable storage will be capped in Brave shortly. Safari is already doing this. So local storage as well will be getting a lifetime. Local storage until now doesn't have an expiration mechanism. You have to manually expire information in it. But with these changes, then that will also be capped on Brave. So Safari is already doing it. Safari and Brave are already blocking all cookies in third-party context. And if you've been awake over this year and the end of last year, you'll know that Chrome has promised to start phasing out third-party cookies so that they'll be expired by, I think 2022 was the was what they said. Well, who knows if they'll actually keep this promise, and promising that they'll do something in 2 years isn't very impressive, if I'm being honest. Chrome is also looking into freezing the user agents. So basically removing all useful information from the user agent string to avoid fingerprinting. Their most recent knowledge is that they'll be phasing this in next year, maybe not even then, but they are already introducing a replacement for the user agent string, which is called client hints, which is a browser API that that you can request for information about the user's user agent. Safari is working on the is logged in API, which can be super game changing for our industry because they are basically looking into blocking all persistent data for users that are not logged into the website. And then all the browsers are working together to create standards around how to continue ad-click conversion and ad-click attribution while cross-site tracking is a thing. So looking at new standards with differential privacy and other ways to kind of preserve vital information for optimizing ad spend. So we're running to the very last slides now. I'm sorry I'm a bit over time already, but I'll try to, because these are absolutely really interesting or important things to share with you. So things you should do in the current state of things. Periodically audit the use of client-side state. Start going over what kind of cookies you're using, what kind of local storage you're using. If you're in the EU area, you should already be doing this because you need to know what kind of persistent data is being utilized on your site. Try to use HTTP only cookies where possible. So cookies that are only transmitted in HTTP requests and not JavaScript cookies. Start figuring out how to incentivize logging in because people who are logged in will be getting special treatment by browsers because by logging in, they are specifically saying that we are okay with our information being persisted, at least related to the login itself. Obviously, there's then legal things to consider and regulation things to consider about persisting information. But in terms of web browsers, logging in is going to be very important. If you do have cookies that need the third-party context, remember to set them correctly with same site. So same site none and secure are required if you want those cookies to work in third-party context on Chrome and on other browsers as well soon. Utilize the storage access API when you do need access to third-party storage. This is important for Safari. So if you do have things like SSO flows or embedded videos, you need to get your developers to utilize the storage access API to ask the web user if it's okay to use their data in cross-site context. And then consider the browser as a manifestation of the user's desire and intent. It's easy to kind of think that, so if the user is using Safari, that doesn't mean they actually want to do cross-site tracking. Maybe they're just using Safari because it's fast. And then you try to think of workarounds. But in my opinion, you should always err on the side of as much privacy as possible. So try to always consider that this is exactly what the user wants. They want to block, they want to prevent, they want to protect. So this is the kind of attitude. Don't look at server-side analytics as a silver bullet. People are throwing this term around like it's going to save everything. Server-side doesn't really solve anything to do with what the user is doing on the web browser. You still need to attach the user to that server-side session. You still need something in the web browser to kind of persist state. You need a cookie that has an authentication token, or then you need to start doing fingerprinting with IP addresses or something other questionable. So server-side analytics itself is not a silver bullet to maybe anything else except circumventing ad blockers, which in itself is a questionable practice. Don't ignore those small web browsers that might not be very interesting to even give a shot at, but they might actually be pioneering some really cool stuff when it comes to this tracking protection. So Clicks, for example, probably never had too many active users, but they were doing pioneering work in tracking protection standards. Don't expect this development to settle down. It's been quiet for a while now. You can see on cookiestatus.com that it hasn't really been updated in a couple of months because nothing's really happened. But these things tend to come in bursts. So Safari does something and then all the other browsers follow suit. Don't spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt about the impact of these measures without empirical data to back it up with. It's easy to say that, you know, when Safari takes away our cookies, everything breaks, the entire web stops working and so on. every single organization should start measuring the impact of these efforts. Start looking at the browser share of your visitors, if possible, and start thinking how much of a problem these measures are coming. And then you can say, this is a big thing, or this can be ignored for now. Don't expect that browsers will start implementing legal frameworks. So, built-in content management systems to browsers, or a GDPR module to Safari, for example. I don't think that's going to happen. I think browsers are concerned about the interface between the HTTP protocol and the user agent. They're not there to implement content management, which is the interface between you as the site owner, your site visitor as the data subject, and then your region's legal frameworks. So that's the interface there. So it's up to the site owner to handle that. Also, don't think that browsers have got tracking prevention right. It's a work in progress, and there's a lot of iteration going on, especially around storing first-party and third-party data. Take a look at these. I'll leave this. This is the last slide. I'll leave these up here. So there's a lot of, and I'll share these slides as well, by the way. I'll make sure that everybody attending will have access to them. But here's a lot of good people to follow on Twitter. There's a couple of working groups on the W3C. And then there's a bunch of blogs and websites that include information that might be very relevant. So I'm sorry for going a bit over time, but we are now ready to jump into the Q&A portion of the webinar.
Yep, thank you so much, Simo. So Simo, so we've got about 10 minutes left. We do have a bunch of questions. Before we get into the questions, for those of you who aren't going to stick around for Q&A, just want to thank you for coming and let you know that the next session will be next week, a data visualization session with Tim Wilson. So if you want to attend that, feel free to reach out to me on Slack if you haven't signed up for that. But if you have, you should have gotten an invite for that. So Simo, I'm going to suggest we go through questions kind of in a quick answer, and then we'll do a more full one in a written format. So I'm going to just start at the top here. So first question, is cookie consent model banners driven out of third-party platforms such as OneTrust is the only path forward with GDPR and CCPA because analytics data gets skewed if we deploy any third-party platforms?
Well, I mean, there's no obligation to use a third-party SaaS for consent management. The IAB has the TCF, the Transparency and Consent Framework, that offers a bunch of API designs that you can use to build your own consent management system, and there are open source options as well. So obviously, like using a third-party system might be kind of an easy way out, but I think it does raise some issues around data flows as well. So it's kind of another processor for you to model. I think that's what I want to say about that situation in this time. Yep. It's a complicated question, and as you noticed, we didn't really talk about GDPR in this presentation. That was a deliberate decision because we want to focus on tracking protections.
And the next question I think you may have covered, but just to be safe, what do you see as the future in terms of cookies?
Yeah, so third-party cookies are definitely seem to be on their way out. So cookies being passed in third-party requests. For first-party context, they are still absolutely vital. So the things that Safari has been doing can be considered to break the web quite a bit. So it's there's a lot of movement in these privacy groups and in these standards to figure out new ways to pass state across the browser and the web server so it's privacy friendly. So there's going to be a lot of interesting things coming up with state authentication tokens and new HTTP headers. But cookies themselves they're just not a very good technology. They're fragile. They're extremely negative to performance because with HTTP requests, all the cookies are included each time. So they take up bandwidth. They're just not a very good technology. I think the persons or the people who design cookies would not be happy that they're still being used.
Okay, cool. Next one, ultimately, how does this undercover battle impact the quality data that we gather from social media platforms like marketing analytics and from our own site, e-commerce analytics?
So this is the impact measurement that I was talking about. This is something you need to determine for your own marketing efforts. There are some sites or some businesses that are not impacted yet very much. Typically, these sites or these analytics practitioners have maybe a bit lower maturity. So they they haven't maybe even noticed what's happening to their users and their attribution. But the thing is, and I'm a bit cynical about this, the thing is, yes, it's unfortunate that our first party storage is being eroded. It's especially hurts in A/B testing where, you know, we need that information about which group we belong in to survive past the browser session. But the fact of the matter is that I'm going to say that most organizations out there they've had data quality issues since they ever started working with data. And you know, with Google Analytics, for example, users have been deleting those cookies for a long time. If you take a long time range, like 2 years, you can see that new users in your data set is going to be almost 100%, because that's the rate of cookie decline. That's the rate of cookie erosion. So the fact that Safari and other browsers are doing this a bit faster now, yes, it's unfortunate, but it might just be part of the paradigm that you've accepted. So we have kind of a couple of options. One is to start working heavily and proactively to improve this situation by looking at things like incentivizing login, trying to figure out ways to rewrite those cookies so they're a bit more persistent. And the other option is to first map exactly how big of an impact this has on you, and then start kind of segmenting your analytics efforts. You have the group of people who will not give consent or who are blocking your analytics endpoints. You need to know how big a population that is so that you can calibrate your data to have that kind of void accounted for. Then you have users who are using browsers that you know, don't survive past the browser session. You need incognito mode or something. If you're somewhat aware of how big that population is, you'll be able to kind of segment your data for that single session data as well. And then you have the logged in people and the people who give consent and the people who have long lifetime cookies. And that's the population you'll be able to really work with. So you just have to figure it out, how big of an impact this is. I wouldn't just start rushing in and doing workarounds without actually knowing how big a problem this is.
Cool. Next question. Has there been any data published yet by the major ad companies on what % they feel that their reported conversions are being understated?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. This is an interesting question. I haven't been researching this too much. I know that Criteo published that they have lost like a fifth of their CPM data from when ITP 2.0 was released. I don't think that Google or Facebook are interested in publishing any actual numbers. If they do any published numbers, they're either going to understate the reality. So saying that much less is actually lost to not lose confidence of their enterprise users, or they're going to overstate it to kind of get empathy and to get people to kind of rally up against the browser. But I don't think they're going to, and even if they publish numbers, I wouldn't believe those numbers for a second. It would require an independent audit from an objective third party to do that. And I don't think that anybody's really interested in doing that legwork for these ad networks. I think there are some estimations around how much money is being lost to this data quality problem, but usually in the same breath, we're going to discuss click fraud as well, which exists as well. So the whole industry is wrought with data quality issues, and this is just one small part of it, in my opinion.
Okay, last question we'll get to. Simo, in your video article about rewriting analytics cookie expiration because of the 7-day cap on Safari, you mentioned you aren't advocating for it necessarily. However, is this something considered malpractice? Yep.
Great. This is a great question to end the webinar with. So Safari has this, and Brave has it as well, that if you use HTTP cookies, so if you actually ignore Brave. Safari has this, that if you set cookies with JavaScript, they will expire within 7 days of being set. So that's just the reality. If you visit the site on Monday, then the next week's Tuesday, the user will be a new user for analytics tools. However, if you write that same cookie with an HTTP response using the set cookie header, the cookie will not be touched by Safari. So I wrote an article and a solution how to rewrite your cookies to become HTTP cookies. And now it's a very relevant question to know that, is this malpractice, or is this a workaround or something else? I'm just going to say it's not a workaround if you're using it for preserving your first party data. because this is exactly why you need to audit your cookies. JavaScript cookies are the problem. They're easily manipulated. They are easily written by third parties behind your back. But if you take the cookies that you want and rewrite them as HTTP cookies, then you're taking responsibility as a site owner, and you're kind of flagging the cookies that you need the most. And since you're not using them cross-site tracking, you're just using them to preserve your optimize experiments or your Adobe Analytics data or whatever you need. I don't think it's a malpractice. It definitely doesn't go against Apple's privacy. I can't remember what it was called, but they had this whole privacy policy thing for ITP. So it definitely doesn't go against that, because it's how you use the cookie, not how it's technologically set. And I think that all organizations should now look at their cookies and try to abandon JavaScript cookies for good, because they don't have a long rosy future ahead of them. But a very good question, and a lovely way to wrap things up.
Cool. Well, thank you again so much, Simo. If anyone has any other questions, since there are still some we didn't get to, go ahead and post them in the Q&A area right now. I'll keep it open for another minute or so. And then Simo and one of my coworkers, Corey Underwood, are going to take a crack at answering those, and I will post that in the tag management Slack group as part of the SDEC. So thank you all for joining. And Simo, thank you again for joining and sharing all of your wonderful knowledge with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for the great questions. And I'm definitely going to tackle the rest as well. So thanks for being attentive.
Awesome. Okay, I'll keep it open for one more minute, and then we'll close it up. But thank you all so much. Have a great rest of the week.